Hi and welcome back to After an Unscheduled Break, Three Legs, Four Wheels F1 podcast. It's Paul here with...
Sean.
Kieran.
Lee.
And our special guest joining us tonight is...
Craig Scarborough.
Welcome back, Craig. It's been almost 18 months since you were with us last. And can't really believe it's been that long.
No, it doesn't feel like that long. But yeah, I mean,
it's only like a couple of minutes since we last had this conversation.
I'm so sorry, I couldn't have.
There's a sense of deja vu with this, yes.
You want professional F1 content? Go somewhere else. Where were we? Yeah, so it's been a while and not a while. It's Schrodinger's formula. What we're saying? So yeah, we've had the new cars. Well, can we still call them the new cars? The current regulation cars for about a season and 2/3 now. And have they done what was expected of them in the first place?
Yes, I mean, I think they have. I mean, I think you could also say no, they haven't, because there's a team running away with it, and it's all supposed to be about getting everyone closer. But I don't think anyone. 18 months ago, we didn't expect Red Bull to start running away with things and the other top teams to make such a mess of the regulations 2 years on the trot. You can forgive 1 year, but Ferrari and other teams really struck last year. So, but I think when you then look at the racing that we've had, and again, maybe if you ignore Max racing out ahead of everybody, the racing's been fantastic. Obviously, the time you tend to see it was at the restarts. I think Silverstone last year was the first time we could really sit and look and say, wow, these cars can get really close at a high-speed track and still overtake. And I think we've seen lots of that over the past half. So, yes, the regulations are what they aimed for. It wasn't the night and day difference that some people were expecting. But I think the job's been done to kick off at least. And now the regulations need to kind of evolve to keep up with what the teams are doing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have been saying, they have to change the rules because you shouldn't have Red Bull running away with it. I mean, Mercedes were the dominant team from the start of the turbo era, and
yep.
I don't think I recall there was quite as many complaints about one team's dominance. I think it's possibly just because of Red Bull and the way that they are, and the way that they're perceived as an organisation. Plus, they've kind of done it before with the whole Vettel run, when they were the team to beat and nobody could catch them.
Yeah. I think you can look back and look at some of the different eras of domination. I mean, you can go back to the Ferrari years, the Red Bull years, and Mercedes years. I think those dominance have been because of a very obvious technical advancement, or some, maybe less or more contentious developments, which you could argue are in or out of the rules that allowed someone to get their sort of step ahead. I think what's interesting, certainly for this year, is the Red Bull car doesn't have a magic bullet. You can't point at something and go, well, they're fast because they've got a double diffuser, an incredible engine, oil burning, whatever it is you want to say, flexing bodywork and all of that. And I think some people are just a bit sort of, a little bit confused by this. And I think there is a lot of negativity towards Red Bull generally. And it's Max doing the winning, who again has been a contentious figure in F1 for a few years. But yeah, I mean, I don't think we expected it, but equally, I don't think any regulations need to change, because I don't think Red Bull have done anything that requires a regulation change. I mean, it's not like, as I say, some of those other issues over the years where, some of the people either choose not to bend the rules, to copy some of the technical. This domination we've seen from Red Bull the past 2 years is just them doing a very, very good job, very consistent. And all of their rivals messing up year after year. Everyone from Red Bull backwards is in a really interesting tight fight, but they're not operating at Red Bull's level with the car. So I think we'll take who don't like it, then it's kind of unfortunate. But the regulations are there, and I don't see anything that they could change to equalise the situation that wouldn't potentially hinder other teams.
In some ways, does that make it easier for the other teams to catch up in the future? If it's not like a specific part that Red Bull have got right, or a trick thing which they've found like a loophole in the rules or something, does that make it more likely that you might get a Mercedes or Ferrari doing a McLaren and taking that massive leap forward?
No, if anything, I think it's quite the opposite. There isn't, sticking your gun and fire up the car and suddenly you're super quick. And, again, the consistency of Red Bull and inconsistent, the lack of performance of their rivals is simply down to, completely understanding to the bouncing and the it's very Red Bull have really got it understood, and just demonstrated the rivals haven't. But having said that, you've seen Aston Martin make that big jump over the winter, and then you've had McLaren have made the big jump through the season. You haven't really seen Ferrari and Mercedes have improved their cars, and I think now we're at the stage where it'll probably only be into next year that someone can evolve their car enough and understand the car enough to actually start to challenge Red Bull. I don't see anyone's really going to have, we may see another race victory from someone outside of Red Bull before the end of the season. That's possible. Maybe unlikely, but it is possible. So I think it has been difficult for the teams because, say Mercedes or Ferrari in the past, they struggle to spend their way out of trouble, and you can't do that in this budget capped era. And in some respects, that again shows the regulations are doing their job, because whenever everyone is now starting to close out, everyone's focusing on the solutions, understanding the error better. And I think we will, as time starts to go on, have a really tight pack that no one can suddenly outdevelop the other teams. We just got to wait for these regulations to settle in a little bit.
There's a few examples, I guess, this year of teams who have either shot forward or slightly faded backwards. Last year, I can't remember if it was even as far ago as last year, it might have been start of this year, when Toto was saying there isn't a silver bullet. You don't just gain a second overnight or so, or you don't gain it in 4 or 5 races. We've seen McLaren be able to gain massively over the early part of this summer. Is it possible to gain that much time? I imagine it is, because we've seen McLaren do it. Is it maybe something that teams like Ferrari and Mercedes just don't have the capability right now to do? Whereas if you're slightly further back, you've got more of a blank canvas to fill up and speed up upon.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, you really need to kind of be inside the factory and understand what's made up McLaren so much quicker. I think, perhaps if there's a magic bullet, maybe not a silver one, maybe it's just brass or something. But I think it's all about that floor working, and a lot of that is stuff that we physically can't see underneath the car. Some is partly to do with the suspension, and just some ways of making the airflow under the car that gives you that performance. And McLaren have come from a long way back, and they've made a couple of big changes, and that's really worked for them. You could argue that Mercedes have made a couple of big changes. Ferrari maybe haven't had the big obvious changes. I know there was the side pod, but that really wasn't the kind of the performance differentiator for them. So I think there is a chance that potentially any team below Red Bull could find something in their floor that could elevate them above all of their rivals. That's entirely possible, and it could just simply be the shape that they've been evolving with the underfloor just really works. I think the difference is that in the past, as you say, and as I mentioned a moment ago, Ferrari, Mercedes could just sit in the wind tunnel and throw different shapes at the wind tunnel and at the CFD cluster until they found the one that kind of hit the sweet spot. You can't do that level of scattergun approach to development, because you have to pick a few good ideas and see where they go. And for some teams, particularly Mercedes, the fact that you have to kind of put your eggs in a basket makes it very hard for you to then, swerve the direction of development to something else. McLaren were, really down on their luck over the past couple of years and have found that jump. And I think Ferrari maybe have found something more recently, but I think that's much more to do with tyre development. And Mercedes are, still very much at sea with their aerodynamic program and getting it to match with what's going on track. So, I think their teams. It's just, you're now getting to the stage where you probably have to make big changes to your philosophy, and that just eats up development.
So, how long do you think it could be then before we actually see someone challenging Red Bull?
Well, I mean, I've always been optimistic. I thought teams would be challenging Red Bull by the middle of last year, and again at the beginning of this year, I thought the Ferraris, the Mercedes, McLarens would have found that time in the car, and they haven't. And I think that's partly because they all really messed up their car design, as a lot of other teams did. Further back down the field, if you're looking at the AlphaTauris, for really wrong. So I still feel optimistic that a winter of development, now that the teams hopefully have got the concepts right, they've got their development techniques in the wind tunnel and CFD right, understanding how these cars work so close to the ground, much more intense championship battle next year. And again, that would be if the teams did their jobs properly. But there's every chance that, one of those potential rivals could, really screw it up again and, the Giro or the Trot have a bad car that they've had to understand and develop. So, it's hard to predict, but there's no reason that we shouldn't see a competitive season next year.
Definitely going to keep everything crossed with that. You mentioned you mentioned putting things in the wind tunnel and throwing a load of shapes into it. I believe that McLaren's new wind tunnel actually came on stream today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was under the impression that it had actually been in production for a while and actually doing development in there. Or maybe the work go on.
Oh, this isn't good. Craig, I think we lost you for about five. Sorry, we lost you for about 5 seconds then.
Oh, all right. We've got a big storm here at the moment, so I wouldn't be surprised if I drop out a few times. I'll just pick up on that one again then. It was my understanding that McLaren already had the new tunnel in production and that they were developing in there. The announcement today suggests that's not the case. Maybe the work that's been going on there has been the work to make sure the new tunnel is given the same results as the new era on track, which is a big piece of work, and it's not something that you can underestimate. Just to make sure that the best thing that you can have is a tunnel that doesn't give you the right results. It can give you false good news, or it can give you false bad news, but it needs to match what happens in reality, or as a comparison to previous tunnels. So it's a huge bit of work. I think it's a big step for McLaren going to their tunnel. They've been using the Toyota tunnel over in Cologne, which is a fantastic tunnel, and I don't think the advantage that McLaren will have is necessarily that they've got a better tunnel now, but they've got a tunnel within their building, that you're not flying a group of people backwards and forwards to Cologne, every few days, and that all puts on the work that they do and on their, on their private lives as well. Which it's a big commitment to be working, in another country for whatever the shift pattern is that McLaren have been running. So I think that should be good. It will always be a risk when you change tunnels, as I've said, that your development might struggle. You might have a little dip initially, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, there's every chance that this is a good step for them, particularly with the momentum they've built up this year in understanding what you need to do to the car. The car has massively improved, so maybe they now need wings to really abreast of the car around what they've learned, optimize it, and come out fighting next year. But already they've got a pretty end to the season in prospect, fighting with Red Bull on Red Bull's bad days, and with race off and leave the rest of them to it.
Yeah, I mean, the last show that we did, and this is how long a break that we've had, unintentionally, we'd actually said on the next show we were going to discuss the top 5 teams and how they've performed so far this season. And I think with having you on the show, Craig, it's probably the ideal time to do it. I mean, obviously that was it was McLaren in 5th at the time, which I think they still are, but I've not got a up-to-date one in front of me. Where have the improvements come from? Because from what they had at the start of the season to where they are now, it looks like a completely different team.
Yeah, I mean, in every respect, but I think, success soon breeds a very different atmosphere in the team. I mean, when you're struggling to get out of Q1, I think there's a different atmosphere at the team. I think the thing that they've really done, and again, it's a massive oversimplification, is they've got that underfloor working. And again, we haven't really seen some of the obvious changes underneath there, and you would probably need to compare with CAD comparison, the old floor or the new floor, but they've got that under. And part of that is the change in the side pods. They've gone very much to this, what I think we may describe as the Aston Martin or the Alpine design, with a very big ridge at the side, and then the very sharply falling waterfalls. That's important, and that really helps get the floor working at the next level. But it's the work under the floor that's made that big change. I'd love to know more about it. And they've just found that working. I think then comes, they've got lots of highs at the moment. We've had a few very good races over some quite different circuits as well, which bodes well. But there's probably lots of other bugs in that car that they still need to iron out in order to really challenge for that the other podium places at each race, or victories, when circumstances allow. So, don't underestimate, that big step that they've made, because they've come from so far back. I mean, if we were having this conversation, 18 months ago, and you compare the McLaren car that was, a complete shed of a car, and you look at some of the design ideas that they had, you look back now and they seem so wrong. So they really have to kind of had to swallow their pride, and I don't like to say imitate or copy, but that's effectively, following the philosophies that Red Bull and Aston Martin have, found that work, and modifying their car to work in a similar way. And as a result, you see, Piastri on front rows, and Norris getting the second steps on the podium, and really looking quite threatening.
Yeah, we're in a position now where, but basically McLaren have the driver lineup they probably always wanted, or I say always wanted, probably wanted since Sainz left, which really is only talking about what happened with Ricciardo, that they do have one person who is 100% of the way there, and they've got someone who's 95% of the way there, which is probably the ideal thing for a team like McLaren, someone who's guaranteed to get a good result every weekend, and someone who's, I'll promise, who is nearly as good as that first driver, so to speak.
Yeah, it feels that Norris is a very new and young driver in the sport, but he's had a good few years under his belt, and he's coped with what has been both a very poor performing car, but also a car has been very hard to handle. That really was Ricciardo's downfall, and even with the updates, the car still handles in a very odd way, and the drivers have to drive around it, which is showing Norris's maturity that he has now, and Piastri's adaptability equally. And you wonder if they can really get that car in tune with the drivers, or the drivers can, no longer feel that they're get the best out of the car, that there is, another step potentially development. I think come with a complete redesign. But yeah, things really are looking quite sweet for McLaren. But we've said this, over all of the years that we've been talking, it's like, McLaren, GP2 engine and a car that, is just awful, to suddenly having a car that's looking good. Then the next season, McLaren, perhaps the most important step that they can put forwards. Maybe their thing is to maintain the consistency rather than drop down in their hands. It's a risky sport, isn't it? Where your development over the winter can really lose all of that momentum you found in the previous season.
Yeah.
I remember it's sometime at the beginning of the season when sort of McLaren were double, and they went to the technical department with a sledgehammer. That there was people back then saying, but if they sort themselves out, will there be questions on whether they've made the right decisions with hiring and firing? Because essentially those people that they got rid of are the people that will put the blocks in place to fix the car. Do you think there's a case of that happening?
It's interesting because they got rid of James Key, and James Key, I've always been a fan of his work. He's always had a very sensible, pragmatic head, and I think the problems McLaren have been having haven't been structural in terms of the technical structure. It was much more to do with the aerodynamics. They got rid of the generalist and promoted the aerodynamicist, and it was like, whoa, is that a good idea? But it seems to work. I still think James Key is, would be still the ideal person there at McLaren, but instead you got Pete Prod, and it's the aerodynamics that have recovered. So something in that change that they've made, it has clearly worked for the engineering departments. And again, it would be nice to have been a fly on the wall to understand how that has manifested itself at Woking.
Moving on a little bit forwards, Ferrari, who got to the mid-season in 4th place. Fred Vasseur's first season as team principal came into the usual Ferrari shitstorm, basically. I don't think there's another way you can describe it.
No, that works.
It's taken him a little bit of time, but he actually seems to be right in the ship, and they don't seem to be lurching from one crisis to the next now. There's a relative period of stability between crises.
Yes, absolutely. I think a lot of us have been Fred Vasseur fans historically, and seeing the sort of the careful, diligent work and looking at every area. I can remember speaking to people at Sauber when he went there, and it's like he's making changes and no one seems to understand some of the changes he's making, but he has almost like a pattern that he follows, a way of doing things. And again, if we look at how Ferrari were with strategy and the car development and the people on board and how the drivers are working with each other, Fred seems to have really settled that ship down, doesn't he? And while I don't think that is the most fantastic car that's on the grid, you can see that Ferrari's biggest issue was they had the car has some underlying pace, but that was very much using its tyres up in qualifying, particularly in Charles' hand, but fall to pieces in the race. And he's corrected that without any obvious technical developments that we can all kind of point fingers at. Now Ferrari are, at least as good as Mercedes on race tyre management. And that really is, regardless of what deck that they're receiving, they seem to be getting broadly the setup of the car was about right. And that, doesn't seem to have unrubbed any of their qualifying performance, which still is, one of the sort of Ferrari sort of standout things. But, that's very much tyre related rather than car performance related. And again, Ferrari is just only ever needed a good manager. They've got, if you down and write out a perfect team, the setup that Ferrari have, with the money, the facilities, it's all there to steer that ship. Fred Vasseur at this point, as you know, many people have been in the past, the right person to deal with it. And again, it makes you then think, well, what's the next steps for them? You know, car development direction is very wrong for Ferrari. There's just lots that's not good with that fundamental car design. And they've said that they will throw that away and start again over the winter. The sporting management of the team with strategy and stuff, while not perfect, we've seen some absolute disasters from Ferrari, particularly in the wet a few races ago. But that's getting better. Tyre management is being understood, and they're doing it. I think one of Ferrari's biggest issues is bubbling up between the drivers. There was animal between Leclerc and Sainz as they joined the two camps. I think Rubb were worried about how it would shake out, and I think we've seen both drivers trying to assert themselves at different points in different races and different situations. I think that is something that we really need to keep an eye on as the season closes out and as we go into next year as well. Particularly Ferrari are much more competitive because Charles has that expectation that he is the main man there. I think Carlos is at least as consistent, only as much as Charles is inconsistent. Ferrari is inconsistent. But when Carlos is fired up, and we've seen that over the past few races, and I remember the first time I ever really noticed Carlos as a driver was when he had been partnered with Max. Max got the Red Bull drive, and I remember seeing the focus that Carlos had that weekend, and it was like, wow, it's like a different driver, totally different mindset. If he can maintain that mindset, then he can bring the fight to Charles on a regular basis, and that only leads to fireworks. Two good drivers in a team is good and bad, and I think hopefully Fred's the person to manage that situation.
You can see the driver issue starting to bubble up in Mercedes as well, can't you? For just exactly the same reason.
Yes, exactly. And again, it's one of those things, as fans, we all want to see the drivers fighting with each other. And if you see there's a de facto number one or someone that's getting favoured in some way or another, us fans tend to think of that as a very negative thing. But it wins drivers' championships. It may impact, the Constructors' Championship, but a steady ship makes for a happy ship and results. And certainly you're seeing a lot of needle between Lewis and George at the moment. And it's quite interesting because, again, the fan base is very much skewed from, recent history towards Lewis. And, some of the stuff that's going on track, they're both getting blamed for it. But, again, I think you can't let that fester. You've got to have some control. At the end of the day, Formula One is a team game. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the team. It's not just about one driver and another driver when they're on track. You've got responsibility for a lot of people. And you can't just kind of shrug and go, well, we're going to let them fight. You're a manager. Manage people, manage the situation. And I think, Ferrari and Mercedes really do have that situation that needs to get under control before you have cars crashing into each other and sending each other off the circuit when you've got, victories or podiums potentially out there. And we've seen both teams, very close to the edge on both of those issues.
If you're Ferrari or Mercedes, at what point do you give up and, at what point do you just give up and sell second-hand cars for a living? Let's try it again. At what point do you go, okay, we're going to be second this year, we're going to be third this year, they won't catch us, we won't catch them, let's look forward to 2024 and put the majority of your workforce onto the next year? How long does that take?
It's one of those things, there will be, even since the beginning of this year, probably even through last year, people working on long-term R&D development that's already leading up to the next 2024 season. In-season development, well, that historically that's always been a bit tricky because it's not been restricted by budget. So, you could keep throwing developments at the car. And because the regulations from this year to next year and potentially the year after are going to be so stable, you can start using next year's development for, early. And that starts to shape your car, in this year as well, and vice versa. You can be using it if you've got budget left over this year to be doing stuff that's going to help you next year, because it's, the money's siloed. The wind tunnel development, the CFD development is all siloed on a per year basis. So, you state what you're developing. And again, it's a tricky question. And I don't think it's as black and white as the press always make out. It's like, there'll always be someone that goes, oh, X team have now solely developing into next season's car. Yeah, it never happens like that. There's always development ongoing on the current car. And it's, it's a shades of grey between one and the other. And, I think we've probably have seen most of the teams now have probably signed off the last developments for this year's cars, and which means that, weeks, maybe even months ago, they were then turning to focus onto next year's car. So it's a kind of a sliding scale. But I don't think anyone really is working super hard on this year's car anymore. We've got Haas are about to have a big update, but that was probably signed off back at Monza or something like that. And the development of it is switched, was ended back then, and then the people that were doing that development will now be working in the Ferrari tunnel, looking at next year's car.
I mean, we saw previously with Haas when what was it, the 2021 car? They said there was going to be no development on that right through the season. Yeah. Look what that started as, and look what it became. It actually managed to get worse.
I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah, also, Kieran, you said, when do you give up and start selling second-hand cars? Derek Warwick is doing really well out of his garage in Jersey.
My grandparents bought a car from Jack Brabham, Worcester Park, Surrey. I don't think it's the same Jack Brabham, but it could well be if he sells Vauxhalls in license over here.
Quite possibly. I mean, the person that used to run Formula One was a second-hand car salesman.
There you go.
I don't know if any of us would choose to buy a second-hand car from Mr. Eccleston. But it's. I think that kind of always used to go with the old way of doing things. You just bringing money in and using the name, wasn't it?
Yeah. I guess this goes slightly off piste a bit, but do you know much about this Bernie Eccleston documentary series, which seems to pop up on Discovery?
Yeah, I've seen nothing of it. Now, with the majority of these documentaries, there's been a few, hasn't there? You've had maybe kicked off with the Senna one, but you've had a Max Mosley one and various other sort of ones, and it's always been signed off by the family or by the person. And if Bernie's had any degree of directorial control over that, then I think you need to go and watch that with an open mind.
And a few large pinches of salt.
Well, I think that what I've always loved with Bernie is he will speak the way he sees the situation. But equally, he will do things just to wind people up and just kind of throw a curveball in there. And lots of people fall for it every time. And if you're on top of that, it's quite funny. I remember he interviewed, it may have been Sky or someone at Silverstone one year, when there was some question about the contract, for the hosting the British Grand Prix was in question. And Bernie goes, no, we're not coming back to the British Grand Prix. There's lots of other places we can go. And of course, he's winding people up. He's throwing that out there to, distract from the true situation. So if you know that, it's quite funny when he does do it. And then you can watch everyone's chasing their tails around and, thinking that what he said is honest and upfront. But that's Bernie. And he's still pulling the strings today. Don't ever misunderstand that. This is still Bernie's sport.
I thought there was going to be some involvement from him somewhere. On the rare occasions when he turns up on the grid wearing the shirt with the old F1 logo.
Of course.
I mean, that's one of the ultimate bits of trolling.
He's a mischievous person. Yes, exactly. He loves it.
That's a very diplomatic way of describing it.
And that's the best way to describe him, because he's obviously got very good lawyers. Tell you what, we'll move swiftly on up the Constructors' Championship. The team that was quick out of the box that surprised us all, Aston Martin.
Yes, and again, kind of goes back to the points we were making earlier. If you get the concept right and get the car working the way you want it to, it works. And the Aston Martin, perhaps in some respects, maybe even more so than the Red Bull, even though it's a slight derivative of the Red Bull concept, is the cookie cutter shape for a modern F1 car to get it to work. And when you see how well they did in those early races, and then you see the development that people like McLaren, Mercedes, to a smaller extent Ferrari, have copied some of those ideas and concepts, have kind of taken that brass bullet that Aston Martin had, and have overtaken them. And Aston Martin haven't developed that car beyond the big step that they made, probably because the gains, once you've got that shape of car and that concept of car, are harder to find, and they're smaller gains that you're finding at the same time. So their challenge has been somewhat stunted. But beginning of the season, I mean, when they got it right, well, they really did get it right, didn't they?
I mean, it helps that all the other teams have got two drivers, but
indeed, yeah. I mean, again, that is always going to be the Lawrence Stroll, Aston Martin issue. Is this a team that you're running to get your son a drive, or do you want a serious stab at this? Because if they'd had two very strong cars at the beginning of the season, the Constructors' Championship would be looking very different now, because they would have got double the points that they have, or a considerable larger portion than they have now, and could be freewheeling their way towards the end of the season, shifting that development a bit earlier. But now, they've already lost out to rivals, which is unusual because, historically, the Force India team have been a team that have kind of come on through the year, and now Aston Martin make a big step over the winter, but don't, make the gains that you would have expected them to.
Is it always going to be difficult when you take someone else's concept, like what we've seen this year, and then having to try and develop it when it's not your own idea? Does that always make it a bit trickier?
Yes. I mean, I think it does depend on the people involved, but I think what you find, there's a lot less opinion involved in developing a car. It's all, everything's run by metrics. Someone just doesn't come in to the design office, big meeting, and go, I think we need to have, this shape of something or another. What you do is, various people will have different ideas, and they will put some figures behind them. They will test them and say, this shape side pod gives us, so much more lap time, so many more points of downforce, so many less points of drag, or what have you. So I don't think there is so much of that there. And because these, the development teams, number in the hundreds, 500, 600 people, there isn't that steering so much from, someone new coming in. I think there will be, obviously there are changes and there are, ideas and directions that get put forwards, but I don't think that is necessarily the stumbling block that some people might have considered that it was, maybe even just 10 years ago.
I'm going back a question, I guess, here, because I just thought might as well slander Lance Stroll a bit more. How important do you think it is to a team's outlook when you come to 24, 25, 26, when the big lump of carbon in the middle of the car isn't as good as the bloke who's 17 years older than him? When does the crossover point happen between, I know he's the son of the boss and he's still an F1 driver at the end of the day, he's one of the 20 best, but when does the crossover point happen between he's worth it and he's not worth it, we need to bring in Drugovich, Hulkenberg, whoever?
I wish I knew.
Yeah,
I mean,
sorry, I don't know why I expected an answer.
No, but I think we often find that, there are some teams, the Red Bull teams, that are very quick to throw a driver out. There are other teams that maybe hang on to drivers for too long, particularly if they are what you maybe regard as a second driver. I won't mention names, but you think, so and so's been re-signed again. It's like, wow, or someone who's new has been re-signed or is more likely to be re-signed for the next year, and you think, are they worth the extra development? Are they worth the extra investment?
Yeah, I mean, some teams keep a driver on for two.
Us fans see lots of these drivers out there. Yeah, I'm glad I don't have to choose drivers, because I would probably be a lot more cutthroat. I'd probably be maybe not as aggressive as Red Bull, but if I was the sporting manager, I certainly wouldn't be as relaxed as maybe Williams would be, or Ferrari can be sometimes, in retaining that second driver. So the problem for Aston Martin is, you've got Alonso, who is, we have to say, is close to retirement.
We said it a number of times.
You should. Is he?
But, there is, he's probably about as closer than I am. And then you've got the problem because it's the boss's son in there. So, what do you do? Who are the people that are going to fill one or two of those gaps? So it is tricky. And obviously there's new management or a change of management at Aston Martin. For better or worse, I think some of those changes maybe were for the better. But yeah, I mean, it's a really sticky situation that they find themselves in, that potentially they could be looking for two drivers and looking for, some continuity as you reach 2026, when you really need to have some stability there to cope with a very different season of cars.
It must have quite a big impact on their development through the season as well, when they're getting two very different sets of data back from their drivers.
Some and none.
I think, again, it's funny, I was having a conversation earlier this week about that very subject, about how much do they develop the car around the driver sort of question. And nowadays, again, going back to those metrics and those, results in simulation and everything, the driver isn't the big influencer that they used to be. And again, people level this, criticism at Red Bull. The car's developed around Max. The car is developed to be as quick as it possibly can be around a lap, and the drivers can tweak it a little bit to make it more to their liking. But actually, the effect of that is that there's making the car slower. So ignore what the driver's asking you for, to a point, obviously. But the teams are out there to make the fastest car, and that has got no driver influence in it whatsoever. So, yeah, I don't think that's a big question for them. But I think you do need to have stability in a driver lineup going forwards, or else you do. There's more to it than just making the car fast. It's about the whole shape of the team and the motivation of the team. And some drivers are better at that than others. And suddenly ditching someone that's popular is has a bigger impact on the team as a whole than changing the shape of front wing end plate or something.
You just know though that whoever gets Lance in the Aston Martin Secret Santa is going to buy him a tennis racket.
I've got nothing further to add to that, actually. I considered it.
No, what I was going to say is, yes, some teams do hang on to the drivers too long, especially if they're a former race winner from Finland. Mentioning no names.
Indeed, yes. That was one of the ones I was trying to avoid saying because I know how popular they are. But
poor JJ Leto.
Right, next up is second place Mercedes. Now, it's a slightly better car than last year.
Yeah,
hooray!
I think we're talking in relative terms here, aren't we? Yeah, I mean, Mercedes really went away over the winter and made the same mistakes they made the winter before or the years before. The car concept is wrong. Their data they're getting out of the wind tunnel is wrong. Maybe even something in their technical structure of the team is wrong. They're not making the right decisions and they're not learning. And that is very much what brought them into the middle part of this year. Again, trying to catch up with errors from the winter. And in fairness to them, they've done an absolutely solid job of getting that car to work. They know what they're good at, and the car doesn't have the level of performance that they want, but they know that they will give up qualifying to get a great race car, and they end up with their, I mean, it's not so much how good their tyre degradation is, it's how well they manage the tyres to control that degradation. And they've outraced Ferrari consistently through the first, only really up until the last few races, outraced Ferrari on tyre management alone in a car that I feel is a slower car overall than the Ferrari is. So they know their strengths and they're working on what their failures are, which is very much, the aerodynamic concept and the aerodynamic testing methodology that they've been using. And, the only way that they know that will work is when we see how fast the car is when they redevelop it over the winter, because there's a limit to how much you can change with the budget that you've got. They've changed their technical structure with James Allison very much coming sort of back front and center. And I don't think that is necessarily him directing the shape of the car development, but James is very big on methodology and getting the work that the engineers do and then looking at those numbers that come out of that and then making the right decision based on those numbers. And I think that he's done a very good job in that respect, and he's just one of those, very much a good leader of the team. We're all impressed when you see him talking on his YouTube clips on their race debriefs. He's just, he's completely across his brief, and it's impressive. But it's a huge team, and I think they've done. I thought they would have recovered quicker this year. I mean, when I was speaking pre-season, I thought that the car could be a race winner. I thought it would be, pushing Red Bull by mid-season, but it's taken a lot more time for them to actually recover the performance in that car. And, I think now it's kind of reached that stalemate where there's a limit to what more they can put into it and get performance out without focusing on to next year. So I think that's what they've done. I think the car that we'll see next year will look very different, in all sorts of shapes and sizes to the car that we've seen certainly in the first half of this year. And I think there's a few other there's just odd things about that Mercedes. It comes on so strong at the end of a race, but on the same tyres, but with heavy fuel tanks, the car looks a real handful. And I know some of that is tyre management, but you do wonder if there's something in that car design. And I sort of pointed my finger at their fuel tank all year because, the size 0 side pods don't come without a penalty. The penalty is that fuel tank is squeezed like, a stress toy in your hand. If you squeeze the bottom half, it's going to come squirting out the top of your hand. I think that car's centre of gravity and the fuel tank being held so high in the car is a real issue for them. And again, they being able to soften up their size 0 concept may actually help with the chassis and that weird layout that Lewis made so much noise about, sitting too far forwards in the car, which again is a byproduct of the weird fuel tank shape that they've got to race. I mean, again, there is every reason that Mercedes can recover over the winter to be dominant next year. There's no reason they couldn't find that if they get the whole concept right, because they're so close with a really bad concept of car. And again, the big risk factor is that they make the same mistakes, the same downfalls that they've made for the past 2 seasons. And, I can't predict that, but I would say the risk of it happening a 3rd season would be quite low, I would hope. And, they'll be out there pressuring the teams into next year.
I mean, if it does happen for the third time, then you've got to think there is something just inherently wrong with the whole structure of the team, and what is going on around them.
I mean, yes, heads will inevitably roll in a very polite and political way. Whether that is on the sporting and or the technical side, you don't know. But they're very much the same people that everyone was lauding just a few years ago that they've made the perfect team.
Yeah. How much do you think? Sorry.
It just goes to show that F1 is cyclical. Yeah.
How much do you think a loss someone like James Vowles is to that sort of dressing room?
That's an interesting question. I've thought about the effect that he would have on Williams, but maybe not the reverse way. Yeah, I mean, I think James is very much one of the people that have been kind of, maybe he hasn't been shaped by it, but he's very much one of those people that is in the Mercedes, upper management mold. You could put him next to James Allison, and maybe not Toto so much, but the people that run that team, and they're all very similar sorts of people. So I think he will be. His loss would be felt in as much that I don't even know who's actually kind of directly replaced him, but he is very much part of the furniture there. And when there's a different bit of furniture, even if it's ever so slightly different looking armchair to what you had before, it will have an effect. But Mercedes is a massive engineering operation, so losing James Vowles with Toto's blessing, because Williams are very much kind of on that radar, aren't they? I don't think his impact would be felt. I think maybe we could go back to the driver situation, and you don't have that person that everyone will trust their word and say, George, this is James, coming over the radio in a way that may have happened in the past. I can't think of any particular situations. We're going back to Finnish drivers again, aren't we? I think they've got strength and depth, but maybe that person, that character that can come over the radio hasn't picked up again since his departure. But maybe we'll see more of that.
Yeah, well, listen out for him giving his opinions to Logan Sargent for the rest of the season.
He's very good on TV. Yes. He's remarkably. I don't know what it is about him. He's just a brilliant, interesting, not maybe the most charismatic, but just a really interesting, broad mind. He really articulates it really well. Unlike me, somehow a radio presenter. But he's got all the right words. He says them.
Yeah.
Just confirm to everyone. Just confirm to everyone, Kieran. Yours is mainly a music-based show, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, very little me on my show. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, he's very much one of those Mercedes people. Again, if you think of the engine guys as well, this isn't unique to Mercedes. It isn't unique to the management. Whenever you speak to these professionals, engineers that work in Formula One now, admittedly, some of them are more less able to communicate verbally what they want, but a lot of them really do. And when you speak to them about their specialism, they're able to just kind of come across with this stream of consciousness of engineering talk, which is both insightful but understandable without being too technical. And it gives you that kind of real confidence, doesn't it? If James comes on the radio and says, this is the strategy that's going to work, then you're going to believe him. If it's, maybe one of their rivals teams coming on when you're saying, no, I don't want the wets, and they go, well, we'll come back to you. It's like, what's going on with the strategy? Where are my tyres when I come into the pit stop? Why are you putting me on wets when the sun's just come out? All that sort of stuff. Yeah, that is a way that a lot of the teams work, but I think you would say that Mercedes across the board have probably got more people in that mould than most other teams.
Mentioning no names, but let's try Plan Q and see if that works. Well, that leaves us with one more team for our half-season review, and that is the team who have been pretty much faultless when it comes to designing the fastest car and putting the fastest driver in it. Red Bull. Have they got...
It is.
Car-wise, have they got anything wrong? Or have they just sort of pulled the perfect car out of...
Doesn't work in Singapore, though.
Except for Singapore. Now, I have been asked to ask... a friend of mine, Carl, said, for God's sake, whatever you do, ask Garbs, why didn't the Red Bull work in Singapore?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can discuss their season as a whole without Singapore. And... yeah, it's just, glowing praise in every respect. I think we'll come back to Singapore, but, they developed the car last year, which was really pretty good. It was a bit tricky at times. They've evolved it. And, for the 99.9% or probably be 22 out of 23 races at the end of the year, that car has been utterly consistent in Max's hands. It's fast in quali, maybe not the fastest. So when people start to talk about dominance, I always think about how far ahead in quali are they? How far ahead in the races are they? And, it's not the fact that car is so much blindingly quicker than everyone else, or else, you wouldn't be getting other people getting pole positions. You wouldn't be, getting those sort of tussles in the first stint of the race. But it is just enough, that's just that bit better than everyone else's, that they can control the race. And when you can control qualifying and the race to a large degree, then there's lots of things you can start to do with the car. This has always been one of the reasons you start to get that kind of snowballing effect that, you got pole, you can, play about the setup of the car. And, Ferrari used to do it. Mercedes used to do it. Red Bull did it in their previous era and again in this one. It's just one of those advantages. I think the thing that we find is that Max and his driving, and that car in his hands performs at pretty much every track, with the asterisks that we'll come to. And we haven't seen Max, apart from, I think it was one of the qualifying sessions earlier in the season when he had a technical issue. It's always kind of there. We haven't seen that session where he's gone and had a big crash, or, the gearbox has fallen apart, or the car, more or less, isn't quite as good at this sort of track than it is at others, with the asterisks again, as we'll come to on Singapore. And it's just super, super consistent. And that is something we don't normally see. Even in, the years of the Mercedes dominance, you always had, a few races where other teams would come in and win because, they either, the driver was inconsistent, had a problem, or, reliability, or the car just didn't work. So, yeah, it's fantastic. And I cannot point at that car and say that's the reason why. Equally, I can't point at that car and say, well, what the hell is Perez doing in there? Because that is, apart from Singapore, is the other fly in the ointment. It's like, why isn't that second car performing? Because when you look at, even Ferrari's dominant years, you would have Barrichello, Massa, Irvine winning races through the year. You would have, Daniel Ricciardo or whoever else, Valtteri Bottas and Nico Rosberg even claiming championships over what you would maybe describe as the lead driver. But you haven't had that really this year, early this season. And I think certainly one of them was that race, and I can't remember what it is, and maybe one of you can remind me, there where Max had an issue in qualifying and could have kind of maybe gone through and won the race, but Perez was maybe too far up the road. Was it Baku, perhaps? Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's fantastic, which kind of then brings you to, well, Singapore. What the hell happened there? And there's a number of things, and none of them really add up to the big change in performance that we saw. Now, I can tell you one thing that it wasn't the Flexi Wings technical directive. It's got nothing to do with that. I mean, you wouldn't see that difference at Singapore anyway, certainly when you then saw the performance at Suzuka, which is an aero track, out qualified, out raced everyone, by whole seconds and 30 seconds. And so the main thing was, they arrived at Singapore. I think they were trying to protect the rear tyres, knowing that they have some issues with traction at times. So I think they went there with a setup and a downforce level, and through free practice, it just wasn't working. and they then started to play about with the car, and I think they just lost a bit of direction. Now, I think they actually made more of a recovery than it appeared. So if you think about that first stint, Max on the hard tyre, coming past everybody, things were shaping up to be really good when he got his tyre stopped. But on the hards, when everyone then pitted under the, was it safety car? I think it was. Max couldn't. It would throw his strategy completely out. So he had to stay out. He effectively lost the advantage of that hard tyre by not being able to pit when he wanted to. And, eventually, what could have been a potential podium winning recovery was lost by, mid-race strategy that was out of their control. So I think it looked worse than it actually was. And I can see no reason, looking at the circuits that we've got coming up for the rest of the year, that situation would arise again. But, so often Singapore has been, the downfall of, Lewis so many times, but equally, he's bounced back and has, dominated there. So I think Singapore is an odd track in many ways. I just, caught Red Bull out maybe more than they expected. And, circumstances in the race, which are always out of your control when safety cars get pulled and stuff. So, yeah, it's just one of those things.
Well, some teams can control when the safety car comes out there, but we won't go into that one.
I know a lawyer.
I was going to say, isn't there like an ongoing legal thing with that at the moment?
I didn't mention any names whatsoever. Right, so we had some other big news today, aside from the McLaren wind tunnel, is that the FIA have accepted Andretti's entry as a Formula One team, but in true Formula One style, it's down to F1, whether they actually get in or not. What kind of process is this where the lunatics run the asylum?
That's Formula One. There are so many people with a vested interest in how the entire sport is run, from, sponsors, partners, technical partners, to the teams. And they have a far bigger say, I have to say, than they really need to have. It'd be like football teams voting to get rid of the offside rule and stuff. It's just madness.
For any Liverpool fans that are listening to this right now, they are on the verge of suing the Premier League because they had a goal disallowed at the weekend.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, VAR, it would never work in Formula One, would it? It's the process is as transparent and opaque at different stages as all of the parties want it to be. And none of us really can make any sense out of it. It's not a procedure and a process that has, a series of tick boxes. It's very much, whims of various people along the way that make this decide it, because it's about adding value to Formula One and, what team will bring something to Formula One that other teams haven't. Now, of course, you've got to think of this in some respects in context of teams that have come into Formula One in the past. That have, simply not been up to the job. And, even the 2010 team intake that we had, some of them didn't even make it to the first, to even building a complete car. And some of them didn't last a few seasons. And then going back to the old days of Andrea Moda and various people attempting to build a Formula One car without the budget and the necessary backing. But that's the background. Nowadays, what must you have to be a Formula One team? Well, again, Formula One has lots of these kind of unspoken rules and ways we do things. There has never been a rule that Formula must be, open wheel, must be, open cockpit, must be, look, a car looks like this. Some of it is kind of like unspoken, instinctive ways of doing things. And I think a new team nowadays is falling very much into that. It's like, well, Andretti has got a fantastic, heritage as a family name in Formula One in motorsport, but it's not Honda. It's not a prestige car manufacturer. It's not a big brand of something worldwide. and a lot of people outside of motorsport probably never heard of Andretti. Maybe in the 70s it was one of those names that sounded, Mario Andretti sounded like a racing driver name, sort of the sort of the ridiculous play on words, isn't it? But I think the issue now is what backing have they got? You've got Cadillac kind of dipping their toe in a little bit, and they kind of only dipped their toe in after that. Andretti found that the water was a lot colder than they expected. So I think the issue maybe is how big are Andretti and what do they bring into the sport, and that's how I see the situation, not how I personally feel. I think they would make a fantastic entrant to Formula One, and will they? Won't they? I couldn't predict that. Looking at the technical ability of some of the other teams and the financial backing of some of the other potential entrants, with High Tech. I can never pronounce it because I never stopped to look at it. Lixings or something.
We think it's shorthand for Lucky Sons.
Lucky Sons.
Is it? Okay, yeah. I've never really sort of stopped to read it and think how to pronounce it because I didn't think I'd never need to do it. But yeah, they seem to have a huge amount of money. High Tech have got the technical ability. I don't really know too much about the Andretti entrants now. I know that they've hired some very good people from Formula One. I don't want to mention names because I don't know how much of that is in the public domain. There was talk about them using, it was actually described as Renault, but obviously that's the Alpine technical partnership, so that would potentially be their engine and gearbox, something like that. And I don't know where they would run their operation. Now, I know the people that I believe are working for them are based in Banbury, which is kind of, Motorsport Valley here in the UK. And there's obviously something their American operation, I'm sure that they would leverage as well, but I don't really know how that would work. So I think that may equally be part of the decision process. It's like, American team running from America, is that a good idea? Is it not? I don't know. And yeah, it's touch and go whether they will get in. I hope they do. I think we could do with more teams on the grid. I don't know if there is a perfect number. 22 sounds better than 20. 24 sounds, if they're all good teams, sounds great. 26 sounds like too many, and I wouldn't want to go back to pre-qualifying. If anyone listening to this can ever remember that, it seems like so long ago. We didn't even, obviously it wasn't even on the telly back those days. We just used to read about it in Autosport, a week later. It's the decision. I think if Formula One decides not to have Andretti in, I think there will be another big outcry about, where is the transparency in this decision-making process and how the sport runs itself, which I was kind of hoping that we were starting to get away from in the Liberty era. But, it still lurks there, as we all know. And that just kind of, opaqueness in doing things and inconsistency in doing things. So let's see how it pans out.
So, I mean, with Liberty, obviously being an American company, we've now got 3 races in the US. You'd think they'd want more American representation on there, and nothing says American racing more than Andretti. And
that is true, but
then again, how many times related to anything in Formula One, you have to use the words, well, you'd think.
Yes, or I just simply can't answer why they've said that or done that. Yeah, it is still part of the F1 DNA to have this strange way of doing things. Yes, you're right. An American entrant would look very good. They've worked very hard to try and get American names and drivers into the sport, and I think that's still something that they're working on. And Vegas, which is coming up, is you can see Liberty are very much kind of trying to find Vegas as the hub of Formula One. They want that to be, more than just a race. They want that to be. They want a campus at Vegas that has Formula One stuff going on. Offices, people working, marketing, doing stuff for the public. There, have like an F1 museum or an exhibit there that suddenly becomes an attraction in itself. And you would have thought an American team would have fitted in. Maybe Andretti don't fit into that marketing image that they want. Maybe they would want to have, I'm trying to think of, I don't know American culture and stuff, but, the Nike team, something like that, the Google team, I think they were looking for that level of presence rather than Andretti with, Cadillac putting a badge on here and there. And maybe that's what they're after. And we don't see anyone coming forwards, offering, the Tesla F1 team or something. There just isn't that people going forwards at the moment. And I think that maybe is what their frustration is at Liberty in making these decisions.
Talking of Vegas, we were offered the opportunity to record the Las Vegas Grand Prix review show at a studio in the city. Unfortunately, they wouldn't pay for our Grand Prix tickets and airfare and accommodation, so we had to pass on it.
All right. Yes.
This is the first I'm hearing of this.
I've been saving this for this show. Yeah, that email's from about 2 weeks ago.
I think I'm about 200 grand in the hole already.
That'll be an expensive trip.
Yeah, it'd cost more for me and Sean because we've got the extra flight to get to anywhere that we can get to Vegas from.
They're non-direct from the Isle of Man anymore.
If you're lucky, you might get Mallorca direct, and that's about it, isn't it?
Yeah, that's only when the pilot takes a wrong turn and he's meant to be going to Liverpool.
There's always hijacking. It's
not... Historically, not the first option.
Or it's Vegas. You could maybe just pay for the one-way trip out there, and then gamble.
Try and win it back.
For what money you've got left. Yeah, that'll work.
Yeah, I'll put my leave request into work tomorrow. Right, so we have the return of the Qatar Grand Prix coming up this weekend. Now, apparently, they've resurfaced the entire track, changed quite a few curbs, and the corners point in the same direction, but other than that, everything else appears to be new and different. And it's going to be different cars running on there than we saw in 2021. It's more or less a new start for the race. What should we look out for and what should we expect, apart from the complete unexpected?
I think the thing is that I think the teams will have a grasp on the circuit and the setup already. That's a big chunk of that is known to them, even though some of the corners have changed. They've kind of got a feel for where they'll be at. It's the surface, I think, is going to be the big question because again, you're going from dusk to nighttime, and it's going to be really hot in those early sessions, and the work you're doing on the tyres. With a fresh circuit that is both a new surface and an unraced surface, it's going to be green as well as being black and sticky. It's going to be really tricky. And I think you're going to have to see how the race... I think people that do well Friday morning aren't necessarily going to be people that are going to be getting pole position. And that therefore means that someone may get the tyres worked out far better than anybody else. There's in terms of layout, there's no reason to think that the status quo that we've had for the past few races won't remain the same. That Red Bull should be the fastest car out there. I think we can kind of say that, but you're maybe drifting a bit into Singapore territory, although I don't think the track in terms of its nature is as slow and rear limited as Singapore is. Then it's going to be who gets it right between Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, maybe Aston Martin there if the tyres are working for them, something they're very good at doing. So I think it could be just one of those weekends where it's going to be a slow burn and just seeing how people get on. And as that race develops and they're finding that their start tyres are working either better or worse than their predictions were, and how you react to that and how good you are at reacting to that, I think it's going to be a bit maybe before Las Vegas, it's going to be a game of poker just to see what cards everyone's holding, and that therefore then should shape up to be an exciting enter the race, which we tend to get more often than not under these new regulations, which is somewhat surprising. Maybe not what they aimed for, but it certainly has made the races worth staying up for.
Yeah, do you think with it being a sprint weekend, that's gonna alter things a lot? Because obviously they're only going to get one practice session before they launch straight into qualifying.
Actually, yeah, I forgot it was a sprint. Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it's eating up time, and I wonder how much people are going to focus on the sprint in terms of setup. I think everyone's going to probably will throw a set of soft tyres on, obviously, but I think they will be very much, thinking about what is the surface doing, how can we predict that on, the harder range of tyres. Yeah, it's going to be a tricky job to work the run plans out for this weekend.
Yeah. How does the whole Parc Fermé thing work over the sprint weekends? Because I know the current rule for a normal race is as soon as you head out in Q1, that's it, you're locked down. But obviously, with a sprint race, you head out for Q1, you do qualifying, then you run everything again the following day, and you have a race, as well as an extra qualifying session.
So, I've got to say, I've not really read the rules in detail, but it's my understanding that effectively Parc Fermé will be in place from the start of the sprint, or maybe even from the sprint qualifying. Because when you see the FIA Parc Fermé changes to the cars, that has actually gone back to the sprint. So you effectively got a double Parc Fermé on a sprint weekend. I'm open to being corrected on that, but that's my understanding. There are obviously slightly more concessions for that, but for the teams. But really, with these cars, the teams can't really change the spec or the setup of the car from the start of sprint, and they probably wouldn't want to. That's just the way that the cars get set up nowadays. The teams have got so locked into that way of thinking. It's just the way they'll do it.
Yeah, it would be unfortunate if they discovered something in the sprint where a change could have been made to make them faster, but then they have to just live with it for Sunday as well.
Yeah, but then that with modern F1, that doesn't tend to crop up the way that it would used to. And if something substantial has changed in the weekend, then the FIA will obviously give them dispensation to change like cooling levels or bits and pieces like that.
I mean, 25 years ago, they'd have brought a separate sprint car anyway.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And a sprint engine,
Yeah.
And a sprint qualifying car and a sprint qualifying engine. The way they were able just to blow money in the old days, now you go look back and think, well, that was madness. But, that's how they race. I mean, I do miss the spare car. I always thought that was a kind of a cool thing. But, I probably wouldn't go out on a limb to try and get that really long life cars that they've got. It seems to work with the teams, and does add a bit of jeopardy to the weekend, which I think always shakes things up.
Well, I mean, Williams suffered that last time out when they rebuilt too much of Logan's car.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, did they know he was going to stick it in a wall and had it mostly prepared just to be on the safe side?
I'm not answering that question online, but yeah.
I'll ask you that.
I think we all know the answer to that. We all know the answer to that.
Yeah, I'll ask you that one after we finish recording.
Mind you, I think for Perez as well in Japan, they could have given him a spare car and he'd probably still managed to trash that one as well the day he was having. Just hit everything.
Yeah.
Oh, he could have fallen down a well leaving the track at Suzuka for his luck on Sunday.
Didn't Latifi do that last year?
No, I think he just got lost.
What, left the circuit and came back?
Yeah, didn't he turn into a chicane that wasn't there?
He did, yeah.
He did.
I don't know if I can remember that, but yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's when everyone realised he's finished.
This is sort of a side tangent because I listened to a podcast earlier on this week, or last week rather, because it's only the start of this week, about replacing Logan Sargent. And are we in a position where we actually are going to replace Logan Sargent, or can we come to a point where we go, give him another season? At what point do we look at Logan Sargent and go, who else is about?
Well, clearly Liam
Is it too
Lawson.
soon?
I think this is one of the unmentioned names from the earlier conversation, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think he was brought in too soon.
Yeah.
Without enough experience and with a difficult car for the first half of the year. Again, Williams is one of those teams that did make a big step with their car, as they did last year, oddly, as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that he is ready for a second season. I think he's going to have a difficult second season because they typically are for any driver, and will probably benefit more from doing something else for a year and have another crack at it. As we've seen, has been successful for so many sort of drivers over the years. So, yeah, I mean, I think Williams, they do have that potential in that car. I mean, it's a pretty good race car they've got now. I mean, there's been lots of issues, racing, mainly Red Bulls, it seems, with the car there. That I think that they would do far better to have another person in that second car getting the job done. Who that is, whether it be a rookie, another rookie, or someone maybe with a bit more experience as well. But yeah, I feel for Logan, but I think he was just dealt a really difficult hand, and I think sometimes you just kind of need to go bust and come back for the next hand.
I mean, if you think about it, it's all actually Otmar Schaffner's fault. Right.
There was just quickly. There was an interesting thing. Sam Bird was saying on I think it was the BBC podcast about Logan Sargent, and he was saying he was speaking to people within Williams that were adamant that the difference in lap time was almost exactly the same as what they expect the difference between the two cars would have been, because obviously Albon is given preferential treatment when it comes to the upgrades that's come along. And he was adamant that inside Williams, they want to give him another year because they believe the pace difference is car related.
Yeah, I mean, we have heard this from the team as well. In a few interviews that I've seen across the internet. I think that is a little bit maybe smoke and mirrors, playing with the data to give you something to back up what you're doing. In terms of just, you can see that he's struggling. I don't want to say that he's not up to the job because I'm not in a position to sort of say that. That's not my skill anyway. You can recognise that in a driver.
The offs he's had lately look like someone that's over driving.
Mm-hmm. Certainly that qualifying shunt and just losing it during the races as well. Yeah. He's in a difficult. As I say, it's a difficult situation he's in, you've yourself and the team need to maybe just recognise where they're at on this, and are we just expecting too much from an inexperienced driver, and will we be better off investing elsewhere or investing in him somewhere while we get a stopgap in or something. Because I think he was picked as the driver at fairly kind of short notice and without maybe the rigour that sometimes would be applied to choosing a second driver. But from my point of view, there's more to it than just pure lap time. And that's just everything that F1 demands of a driver, as well as just getting those sector times. And he's sadly he's falling down on that.
Do you think it puts extra pressure on, given how good the crop of rookies we've had lately have been? When you look at when George came in, Lando, Oscar Piastri, Albon, I know he had a harsh time in Red Bull at first. I still believe there's like a world championship fighting driver in that guy. And it almost looked like for a second, especially with Piastri coming in, it almost looked like, it's easy finding this young Formula One driver. You just reach into the junior categories, plug them in, and they're instantly a Formula One driver. It seems like it might be a tough axe to follow
For every
Yeah, I mean,
for
you're
every
right, we've had
Piastri, there's a Mazepin.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have had some great talent come into the sport, and again, which makes me really sort of slightly wound up about retaining older or drivers that are struggling for longer than perhaps you need to. And again, I'm not a great judge of drivers. That's not really what I tend to spend my time looking at. But I will notice when a driver does something good, where they're driving above their car or the situation that they're in. And I think we've seen like Liam Lawson do that when Nando, not Lando, it's the other one, Lando joined. You saw those immediate flashes of performance, and you could argue even Tsunoda in that in those first few races, you think, wow, this the Japanese driver that's going to crack it, and kind of the end went off the cliff a little bit, and it seems to have kind of recovered from that now. But I've not seen that with Sargent. And we've had plenty of wet sessions, plenty of tricky races where he could have kind of come through and hasn't. And for me, when the drivers don't show that opportunity, particularly someone at the back of the grid in sadly typically a Williams sort of driver, if they don't show the performance and their skill in their moments, then I tend to think, well, is it there at all, or are they just a kind of a good dogged driver that's just going to kind of get the job done at the end of each race. And I think maybe Sargent might fall into that more than some of the other young and up and coming drivers or the recent rookies.
It's going to be one to watch for the rest of the season and see where it goes, because obviously there are young up and coming drivers available. It's whether Williams want to take the risk after years of Latifi.
That's surely
they can sign him for another year and say that up front to everyone, but at the end of the day, a contract is there to be broken. And if they want to get rid of him because he crashes in the last 3 races, or maybe having a contract might take the monkey off his back and let him relax a bit more and start to perform in the car. But yeah, there's nothing is certain, and if he crashes at race 1 next year, he could equally be out very rapidly, and there's no shortage of people with the skill and the budget to come in and replace him.
Yeah, that is true. Going back to things that actually make the drivers go fast, I've had another question from Baz, one of our Dutch listeners. He says he'd like to know your thoughts on the 2026 engine regulations. He's not liking a lot of what he's hearing about it so far. What do we know so far about 2026? Just for the uninitiated.
Right. Okay. So there's a whole batch of changes. So let's take the engine you've got now. You've got a 1.6 litre injected turbo engine that, with the hybrid system, gives you 1,000 horsepower, and that 1,000 horsepower will be available pretty much for every potential lap that you would do. You'd have that 1,000 horsepower available when you need to use it through a race. So that's pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty impressive. And these engines last handfuls of races. 2026, you're going to keep the 1.6 litre turbo engine with the direct injection and with the turbocharger, but it's going to run on different fuel. It's going to run on biofuel, which is slightly different to sort of ethanol fuel, to e-fuels. And this basically means that we're not consuming hydrocarbons, oil, to fuel the cars. So it's all made completely from sustainable sources, which is fantastic. It's doesn't give you as much power as petrol does, or kerosene, or gasoline, whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, they're also going to reduce the amount of fuel that you can squirt into the car. So now the combustion engine is only going to give you maybe 500-600 horsepower. So the rest of the horsepower is going to come from the hybrid system, which at the moment is capped at just 160 horsepower. So if you think if they've got 1,000 horsepower, then theoretically 840 of it, slightly more nowadays, comes from the petrol engine, 160 comes from the hybrid system. So they're going to ramp up the hybrid system to give you that missing 500 horsepower. which means you've got a much bigger motor, you'll have a much bigger battery. But they're then getting rid of the MGU-H, which is the electric motor that's attached to the turbocharger, which has been so difficult for teams to develop and quite tricky for teams to work. Rival struggled. Honda, was the obvious how to use timeout, but all of you behind. But then they're going to do loads of other changes. So you're going to struggle to be able to regenerate enough energy from the rear axle as you're braking. So you're actually going to be using the petrol engine on the straights to charge the battery. So it's a bit like the dynamo on your old bicycle. You kind of click it on and you can feel you're having to push against it. So you're actually going to be able to burn an amount of fuel each lap to actually run the engine and charge the battery on the straight, which I think is a bit of an odd one when you used to have something you do with that for free with no petrol. And then to try and make it a balanced ballpark and to reduce cost, parts of the engine are going to be spec or tightly restricted. So unfortunately, it means the engines will still keep the same horsepower, but they will be heavier. And the fuel tank, the fuel load will be reduced by quite a few tens of kilos. And there's just, some of the decisions make sense and some of the decisions make no sense. So I know the MGU-H was taken out because it was thought to be an obstacle for Audi joining the sport, which is the kind of the common paddock consensus. Equally, being able to have a hybrid motor on the, or a hybrid generator on the front wheels was a great idea because you do most of your braking on the front wheels, actually recovering energy there meant you could have tons of electric power available, all the way around the lap. Been fantastic. But Audi coming in have been racing for decades, well, maybe not decades, but a decade and a bit, with a front hybrid system in endurance racing. So F1 teams thought, we're not having Audi advantage, even though we've given up an advantage. So there's lots of things that are fighting against each other. And I can understand lots of what they're wanting to do. And then there's lots of it I don't understand, quite frankly. From a fan point of view, the good thing is that you're still going to have superpowers and will probably start the race about the same effective weight of the fuel tank and the power unit as you do now. So I don't think there'll be much of a trade in Audi coming into the sport, which I think is, obviously a great thing for Formula One. But yeah, I think you're kind of, what you're taking with one hand, you're giving away with the other. And it's the same with the chassis regulations.
I mean, I assume there's going to have to be new chassis regulations to deal with the new weight distribution around the cars.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole heap of regulation changes. Again, it's all, if the efficiency of the car is going to be a big factor. So the cars will be a bit shorter, not as short as I think they should be. But again, the teams are kind of putting their oar in. And we may only get them 20 centimetres shorter. I think the FIA tries to go for 30, but we're being pushed back. Personally, I think they should be looking more like 50 or 60. And that's entirely possible. The cars will have less downforce. They will have drag is going to be a tricky one because you've got the cars will be shorter and slightly narrower, which is worse for drag. But equally, you're going to have active aerodynamics. So the rear wing, the front wing, the brake ducts, the cooling ducts will all be able to be moved. We're not quite sure how through a lap. So that on the straight, for example, even without DRS, your wings could flatten off, your cooling ducts could close up, and the car be much more efficient. You're burning far less fuel on the straights than you need to, just dragging these wings needlessly along the straight. But then they all sort of pop out as you reach the braking zone, which I think is actually could be potentially a really cool thing to look at. But again, we're not quite sure how it's all going to shake out. It probably won't come down by much, if at all, which again is one of the other big sticking points for a lot. And the cars probably the on balance probably that weight. Yeah, it all kind of swings around about concept will be part of the gist of the regulation. So again, we should see cars encouraged to like in the past year.
You're breaking up badly again, Craig.
Oh, am I? Okay. Do you want me to pick up on that, or do you want me to? You're going to just chop that?
I should be able.
We
to,
got the gist.
Yeah, should be able to get something out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Now that is great. That is a really good insight into what to expect in F1 in times to come. Hopefully, we'll still be around to cover it. And we'll try and do weekly shows again.
Yes.
We're going to try and do an extra one after the sprint this Saturday night. I've just landed that on everyone now.
Do you not have a gig on Saturday? I thought you had a gig on Saturday.
No, we cancelled it because I didn't want to do another gig the night before we go on holiday, because the last time I did it, I didn't realise at the time I had pneumonia. So I didn't want to chance it again. I only found out when I was halfway up a mountain. So, no, we don't have a gig, so we'll be doing, we'll hopefully be doing a show after the sprint at the weekend.
Is that because, I don't know, we might have a world champion on Saturday?
There is a chance.
That's true, yes.
There is a chance we could have I was going to say a new world champion, a repeat world champion.
A 4-time world champion.
3.
I'm giving him 2020 just to see how that goes down on Twitter.
I think the words cold, sick, and bucket. I was going for the 3-peat.
Yeah, the 3-peat is good.
So yeah, we're going to try and get a show done after the sprint, and next week's race review podcast will it'll be a little bit different because it all depends on what the Wi-Fi is like in the hotel that we're staying in.
And I'm at a wedding on Sunday, so yeah, I might be mainly grunts and moans on Monday night.
Well, we'll be on a plane when the race is on, so we're just going to have to make do with the highlights.
Ooh.
Of which I am sure there will be many. Thank you once again, Craig, for joining us. It's always great when you come on, and we definitely won't leave it another 18 months next time.
Yeah, let's try not to. Definitely not. No, it's always good to come on.
Tell you what, let's say it now. Let's go for one at the end of the season.
Yeah, let's get that one in. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, we'll get something for the end of the season. Obviously, if you want to get in touch, we've got the website, threelegsfourwheels.com. You can put your predictions in for the Qatar Sprint, the Qatar Grand Prix, and I've also opened the predictions for the USA Sprint and the USA Grand Prix as well, because I'm damned if I'm working on a website too much while I'm lounging by the pool having cocktails brought to me. Yes, it's that kind of holiday. If you want to get in touch by email, it's threelegsfourwheels@gmail.com, and we're at 3legsfourwheels on all the socials, and individually on, are we calling it Twitter, X?
On my show, I call it Elon Chat.
I like that.
Yeah, but Lee, you are a fervent musketeer.
Hey, he's all right.
Oh, God. I've not heard of Musketeer before. That's quite good.
Yeah, Lee's now changing his name to D'Artagnan. But if you want to get in touch with us on that individually, we are
At Sean Cowper.
At Kieran is boring.
At the Lee Stevens.
I am at Pablo100. Chris is at Flood21. He will be back soon. He's recording some special inserts for us as well. And Scarbs, how can people get hold of you on Twitter X?
Well, on all platforms, I'm at Scarbs Tech. You'll find me doing more for once.
Yeah, I think we're on Threads at 3 Legs 4 Wheels as well, but I'll have to check because I barely use the app. Right, we'll be back at the weekend. Sounds odd saying that. So enjoy the race, and we'll see you soon. All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.